Good day. And on behalf of the Carnegie Council and the Artificial Intelligence Equity Committees, I want to thank you for joining us today. We are very fortunate to have some esteemed colleagues joining us as part of what we hope to be a series of discussions around artificial intelligence, equity, the issues surrounding AI and technology, particularly in Africa, and looking at it from an African perspective. We're quite fortunate to have colleagues from that span experience and from all over the world. And I'm going to start with Nanjira. Why don't you introduce yourself just briefly and before we get going?
Hello, everyone. I'm Nanjira, based out of Nairobi, Kenya. I research and analyze tech, public policy, and global governance.
Thank you. Corinne.
Hi, Chip. It's very good to be here. My name is Corinne Momal-Vanian. I'm the executive director of the Kofi Annan Foundation. We're based in Geneva, and I joined the foundation last year after a long career at the United Nations, and we deal a lot, but not exclusively, with the protection of democracy and electoral integrity.
Thank you, Corinne. Warren.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for the Carnegie Council and Chip for inviting me. I am Warren Hero. I am a technologist. I was previously the Chief Technology Officer for Microsoft in South Africa, as well as on the continent. And currently I am both the CIO as well as the Chief Digital Officer for Wentzel, a large firm of attorneys working out of Johannesburg.
Thanks, Warren. And as you can see, I'm Chip Cottrell. I have had a really fortunate career, spent most of my time working and living overseas. I currently am a director at Holland Knight, which is a US-based law firm, although I'm not an attorney. And I spent the better part of 20 plus years at Deloitte, leaving there as the global chief ethics officer. So this is a broad topic, and I'm excited about the platform that we have to develop this. And Corinne, the Kofi Annan Foundation works around democracy, works around equitable approach. Talk to me a little bit about how you see technology and the whole issue of artificial intelligence as it relates to its impact on what you're doing and what the foundation is doing.
Sure. I mean, let me backtrack a little bit, maybe. I mean, I mentioned that indeed the foundation works a lot on promoting democracy, promoting and defending democracy. So what happened was in 2018, before he passed away, Kofi Annan, with his usual foresight, established a high-level commission on democracy and elections in the digital age. And he asked them really the commissioners to look at how essentially social media and the internet and the algorithm that underlie it were eroding democracy around the world. So not specifically in Africa, or not even specifically in the global South, around the world, but he did ask them to look also at what was the specific impact in the global South, and of course in Africa. So the commissioners issued their report early last year, and what they said is that in general, social media do not create polarization. It just, as we know, amplifies it and intensifies it. And they looked at really issues of foreign interference, disinformation, hate speech. And what they said was that clearly some countries, some democracies are more vulnerable than others to this phenomenon. And they describe some of the factors that make them more vulnerable. And what we've done since the issuance of the report is really look at specific regional and national context and try to identify those vulnerabilities. So, which are typically when societies are already polarized around religious or ethnic lines, when there is mistrust in traditional media and so on. So a lot of what we saw, by the way, in the US with the last elections. But I mean, these phenomena exist in many countries in Africa. And what we've seen is that, unfortunately, the pace of internet penetration has been so fast, and especially has been so fast, and it's happening now very fast in countries that are particularly vulnerable and fragile, that it is impossible for digital literacy, the pace of digital literacy, to follow. And therefore that even increases the vulnerability of these democracies to the inherent dangers of algorithm in this political sphere. So this is what I could say in introduction, Chip, but we really are concerned at some of the imbalances that we see in as relates to AI on the continent in the political sphere. And I'd be very happy to go over them a little bit deeper later if you want.
Yep, I'll look forward to doing that. Nanjira, do you have a similar opinion here, or, as I know that your focus has been different, but can you comment upon where you think that the challenges are?
Sure. First of all, I think with the matter around social media, which tends to be the useful lens to understand some of these other technologies, I think a key challenge is that when these algorithms are being designed to recommend content, for example, they're not necessarily then applicable for explainability and transparency in other contexts. So that you find that when we talk about hate speech, for example, we had what was going on in countries like Myanmar and many other parts of the world, where the same universal application of these tools was aggravating very different contexts. And that has been a key challenge to understanding how algorithms are impacting social media use or democracy through social media, for example. And another thing there would also be language, obviously. It's one thing to train machines to understand English, the English corpus. It's another thing to train them for the diverse thousands of languages spoken in places like here. But I also want to add one interesting challenge/opportunity that will be presented when we start moving more towards voice as well. And whether it's the companies that are introducing AI-oriented algorithmic ML tools will accommodate these different corpuses of language and have people, whether it's content moderation or a way to sort of audit how that fares in terms of what is recommended as content to other people. So that's where we're headed with this particular challenge.
So I'm going to probe on that just a second, Nanjira. I too see this as a fundamental issue to this process. Can you talk about some of the things that you're seeing as potential solutions to help correct this?
Sure. The big questions now happening around how we govern these technologies, how you have a US company accountable to the citizens of a country that they're not registered in. This is going to be a very potent issue because the contexts around which these technologies are being applied or being used are not as neutral as we'd like to imagine, even as the technology is being designed. So these conversations are becoming very important and moving the conversation about AI governance from just the technical sphere to accommodating the very real social political environment. And in regions like ours, that are usually left behind and decided for, it's going to be very important to make sure that, as more and more people are coming online, as Corinne was talking about, they're not going into cesspools of, toxic spaces, as we've seen with the way algorithms tend to sort of reinforce more of those complicated sort of and typically adverse situations on the ground. So this is going to be very interesting and a conversation to keep pushing for.
Thank you. By the way, I've seen some comments already popped up in the chat. If the audience has questions that they would like to raise to any of the panelists, please do not hesitate to put that in there, and our colleagues from the Carnegie Council will bring them to our attention here in not too different. Warren, you and I have known each other quite a while, but I don't think that Nanjira could have laid a better opening for you, knowing the smorgasbord of things that you have had your fingers in, and in particular, a big American company that you had spent time with that you've already identified that is got an influence around this. And I know that it was a passion of yours to make sure that the voices were being heard as part of this. So talk about the smorgasbord.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think a couple of things. I think starting off with Corinne talking about these imbalances or asymmetries. I think part of what we have to do is I think we have to be not just understand that those asymmetries exist, but we have to understand the nuances, because in the way they exhibit in South Africa versus Botswana versus Kenya, versus Nigeria, look really different, right? So I think that's the one aspect, understanding the nuances of the asymmetries. I think part of the issue is around broad technology literacy, and often as individuals that run companies or individuals that make legislation, often I find there's a paucity or a lack of understanding about technology, the potential of technology, because there are both positives and negatives, and you have to understand both the pros and the cons, so that we can deal with the pros and the cons. The other aspect, of course, is skills. I mean, we have one of the significant asymmetries that we see is around skills. And, as Nanjira talked about, is the explainability. If we want to be able to understand the context of these algorithms, potentially understand mathematically as well as practically how they exhibit these imbalances or the biases, you have to have that deep knowledge. And then, of course, development ecosystems. It is only probably in the last 3 years that we're starting to see really vibrant development ecosystems. But a lot of the tool set, though, is still not resident in Africa. I think there's maybe one or two of the digital dragons that have a footprint in Africa, and where the tools become readily accessible and utilizable, because the difference between an organization that can apply the technology versus not is starting to generate significant competitive advantage, and also differential competitiveness from a market point of view. And of course, in terms of narrative, because of these imbalances, we find that we are, as Africa, also becoming marginalized, in the context of that narrative about determining the content of the algorithm, or even the representation in the databases, right? So a lot of the disease databases are significantly skewed to European populations, not to Asian, not to African. And because of the fact that often, individuals using these algorithms don't understand the fact that, from a disease profile perspective, because there's underrepresentation of African populations, just using this directly could result in some significant issues. And then, of course, we then have to speak broadly about the trust in technology. What are the components of trust in technology, and what are the broad components of trust? And how do we start enabling every single person in the community to be able to find their own voice, and then potentially start, exploring these components of trust?
Ward, I'm going to come back at you on this trust scenario, because as you and I have talked about quite a bit, this is potentially one of the most significant issues that we're seeing, not just in Africa, but globally. I have been speaking rather and attempting to be as vocal as I can about the trust components on the continent in the most trying to look at accountability and transparency. So Nanjira, your comments around taking that these initial steps, but actually having that be part of a trust, I'll call it a trust euphoria that is almost going on right now, that we're trying to see people push toward that, whether it's things that you see in the World Economic Forum or the initiatives that they have on the continent or otherwise. So, but Warren, what kinds of things are making a difference? And you're seeing it with a series of different lenses. So put on your digital hat here for the moment and tell me what kinds of things you're seeing there as a differentiator.
Yeah, and I would say to you, first of all, access. I mean, Nanjira spoke about, this proliferation of internet access. And so I think, that, when we have to think about the platform and we have to think about the ecosystem, and when we think about, the platforms that we are creating, these developer ecosystems are one of those, so whether you think about any of, the digital giants, they have these vibrant developer communities, but my concern is often that, often those algorithms and that intellectual property that gets produced once again gets exported. And we remain, we remain subjects of the fourth industrial revolution and not proponents of the fourth industrial revolution. The other aspect is around skills, the impact, and I think this is the issue about, the potential of the use of micro-certifications and what micro-certifications can do for people to be competent at a specific capability, I think is really interesting. Because no longer do you, when you maybe drop out of school, you can still achieve a level of competence and then use that competence to create economic opportunity for you and your community. And then, of course, I mean, because of the nature, and I mean, for instance, the work that we're doing in Botswana, the use of technology in being able to prevent human-animal conflict and being able to reduce that because of drought, and sporadically, how droughts happen. IoT and artificial intelligence in agriculture in order to ensure food security. And then probably for me, which is really an unintended consequence because of the fact that you're almost having this nascent connectivity that's creating this nascent transparency is, what transparency and technology and transparency can do for democratic institutions and to keep all of us accountable, whether public sector or private sector, because of the fact that there's, when you know where to look, that information, those data points can become visible and viable to you.
Nanjira, you look like you were about ready to say something there.
Well, Warren raised very interesting points. I think one important thing maybe to encapsulate our conversation here is maybe just because as a continent, we're not net prosumers, and that by that I mean creators of the technologies themselves, does not mean that these issues or even how technically they should be applicable to our context is to be an afterthought. And the other side of it being that because diversity of data sets is the key thing everybody is going for, then that puts us as a site at the center of it because of just the sheer diversity of humanity that exists on this continent. That does call first and foremost for our own policymakers to step up and raise awareness about this and actually eke out a space in the table when these conversations are happening, whether it's at a place like WEF, where, prospects of how AI could go into governance mechanisms, whether it's in health, whether it's in education and otherwise, they can bring up these contexts and really amplify the voices of those who are sitting with those impacts on a day-to-day basis. That's one particular part. But it also, in answering and baking in a question that Christina asked me here about expanding on the auditing and impact assessment scores, I wanted to say that first and foremost, where we end up with auditing technologies that are governing our lives, it's just one part of the governance process. The risk of focusing on it alone is typically people say, okay, we'll develop everything, deploy, and then audits will be after the fact. And typically it will be after there's been an adverse outcome. So we just have that as one of the toolkits, and maybe even having audits before deployment. So before a government procures an AI designed system for welfare, for example, how can we make sure that the communities it's supposed to be serving have been involved in the conversation? It's not that they have to be technical experts, it's just that they're experts in their lived experience. And that is first and foremost what should foreground how we think about governance of technologies like AI, in as much as the technical aspects, what we would call the vertical sector of AI, is just as important for the same conversations to happen in parallel. But I think if we're going to be talking about equality and governance and coexistence and cooperation, really, that understanding that social impact, social political, social cultural impact is very important when we're discussing the future of AI in our lives.
Corinne, the UN had done an awful lot around looking at this from a constructive perspective, I will call it. And how do you marry what some of the work that the foundation has done and that you've seen within the UN system as it relates to what is actually going on in Africa? You've heard some, I think, not insurmountable issues pop up, but clearly issues that have got to be addressed in the broadest kind of context. Where does it, from your experience, can we see the light almost at the end in a tunnel? Hopefully not a train coming at us, but a beacon that's drawing us toward it.
Before I come to that, Chip, maybe if I can just comment on something that Warren and Nanjira also have mentioned.
Please.
Like, we shouldn't, I mean, when I know that we tend to, especially the foundation, we have talked mostly about digital threats, but we are entirely aware that we shouldn't throw the baby with the out with the bathwater, and that there are many, many benefits that Africa can derive from AI and big data. I mean, food security was mentioned, energy efficiency, healthcare, I think Warren mentioned. So all these things, as long as Nanjira said, they are properly designed within the right governance frameworks and so on. So the light and the light at the end of the tunnel may be in the fact that there is definitely awareness on the continent of the need for this framework. The problem is that, for instance, we had a discussion the other day with European and African experts about whether some of the work that the European Commission is doing at the moment on something which is called the Digital Services Act, which is meant to regulate the digital space and disinformation and so on, could be replicated, or whether Africa could, base some of its own regulatory work when it starts it around this. And really everything has to be very context specific, as Nanjira said. So, but there is very high awareness. For the first time last month, the African Commission on Human Rights, which is a subsidiary body of the African Union, in its last session, had for the first time adopted a resolution about the impact of AI, which I think as a really, when it percolates down to a bureaucracy like this, or an institution, it means it's already everywhere, So I think, and one of the things they said is definitely that one part of the resolution is that African voices must be heard. African governments and other actors must be part of the global conversation on AI. So I thought that was very encouraging, that there is definitely a great awareness of the need. The other light of the tunnel, at the end of the tunnel for me, is that there is also awareness in coming back to the issue of democracy. There is great awareness of the platforms now, of the tech platforms, of their impact of their social political impact. We talk a lot to Facebook, for instance. They come to us and they ask us now for our opinion, to us and many others, I'm sure, ahead of elections, for instance. What is, to tell them, is there any risk of violence? Have we identified a fragile context that they have to be particularly mindful of? And then we tell them, and of course we always cite the issue of the fact that, the languages that Nanjira mentioned, that you have to take into account that a lot of content is created in local languages, therefore your moderators must be able to understand these languages and so on. But they are conscious. They're not, I would say, publicly acknowledging a responsibility, but they are accepting that they have to be part of the solution. And we find that this is really, really encouraging. And certainly we are talking to the Twitters and the Facebooks and so on in Africa in this context. So I would say those two things are encouraging to me. The realization at the governmental level and intergovernmental structures that there is a need for a regulatory framework of some kind, and for also Africa to be part of the more global efforts. And then the realization by the acceptance by the tech actors of part of their responsibility.
Well, that is really interesting to see that engagement, and I'm glad to hear that they're coming to you as well as you engaging back with them in a broad series of perspectives. One of the issues that I've noticed in the 25 years that I've been working in Africa is that opening up that dialogue, be it and I saw there was a point come up with e-commerce, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes during the Q&A. But there are the challenges that are faced as the rest of the world goes into different kind of context of procurement, different kind of context of consumer and demand and needs, and looking at this from a how do you stop corruption as part of that process, which is a huge issue in beating kind of drums. And it occurs to me because one of the areas I focused on, and in fact, using some of the tools that the WEF had set out through the Partnership Against Corruption initiative a couple of years ago, is that a focus on trying to understand the tribal influence as it relates to setting the tone within different geographical regions. And I mean, you may have 150 tribal influences in a small country as opposed to the larger context. So Nanjira, I might come back to you and ask you to to comment on that. And then I'll come back to Warren and then to Corinne around is this too much of a stretch to think about an equitable approach is as it relates to by understanding the tribal influences and trying to use that as part of an initiative to make sure that we're getting a better outcome?
I would hesitate to frame it around tribal because that's so nuanced and has different political connotations, because you could argue every region does have its own tribes. What is important is indeed the question of governance. I mean, even before you add the technologies that distribute the tools and the resources that are available. And so here we're talking about technologies intersecting with old school or analog governance issues. And we know that that's a serious political undertaking, which is also very strongly linked to how Africa's position in the world has been vis-a-vis aid and impositions, if you will, around how to govern yourselves, in stream, mostly like half-baked solutions coming from somewhere else or from a strategy paper from somewhere without much context. And the risk when those two things merge, so you have the AI or AI systems or emerging technologies coming into these intractable challenges, is one with AI specifically. There's an idea, almost a fetish, to sort of bring in administrative universality, so that if it's tried out in a small setting, even if it works, say in Rwanda, does not necessarily mean it translates to a small enough country like that as Togo. And because the technologies are also not being designed in a neutral setting, these are two strains of conversations that do have to happen in lockstep. And that's why when we think about the governance of digital technologies, whether it's AI or even just advancing internet connectivity, we absolutely have to keep going back to what's the community that's supposed to be served? How are they being seen in the insights, in the raw material that is being fed through the processes of decision-making, whether they're technological or analog, that then give us those outputs? And especially also those who've been historically excluded. How do we make sure we do not turbocharge that with these technologies that we are almost a bit too excited to adopt? Not because they will not serve the purpose, but they cannot course correct alone by themselves for these exclusions and inequalities that exist across all societies in the world.
I could unpack that and we could stay on for another 5 hours. I think just in the last 3 minutes of your conversation, that is really good. Thank you. But so Warren, it occurs to me that the experiment that you and I are working on in Botswana might be able to use some of the same kind of influences that Nanjira and Corinne have been talking about. Where do you see? Why don't you describe a little bit of that and maybe what the implications might be for the broader sets of solution?
Absolutely, I will do, Chip. I think philosophically, part of what I believe is really important is to understand, some of the philosophical groundings. So I refer to Walter Truett Anderson, that thinks about governments and institutions as linguistic structures. And he talks about the fact that even problems that strictly aren't communication, like failures of mechanical systems, can be explored in terms of things said and not said, questions asked and not asked, conversations never begun or left uncompleted, alternate explanations not discussed. And when I think about the universality, one of the things, remember, leading up to us considering the issue around the Mahon Science Park, was to take the conversations that communities were having, and they're called Legotle in our in our part of the world in Southern Africa. So communities gather under trees and they have conversations. We, through some really simple technology, were able to make sure to record that and using natural language processing to bring that into the legal and legislative process for Botswana. And so that ability to listen to conversations and to bring those conversations and then to extract from those conversations insight and understanding, and also to appreciate the context, because of the way these new artificial intelligences learn, that we are able to move away from just having to worry about really big data sets. So I think that's the one opportunity. But the opportunity for, to link things like the Mahon Science Park, and I'll spend a minute on it, is in the context of the country's entire digital transformation. And we understand that as a country, Botswana has a couple of things going for it. So, the agrarian economy, of course, tourism, and then, of course, the natural environment. And so the ability to conceptualize a sustainable approach to what sustainable communities could look like, and how those sustainable communities could trade with each other, and how that trade can then impact on creating grids, and specifically energy grids that are community-based, and then because of the mesh nature of the grids, create more robust electricity supply, make sure that every single person in the community actually participates, and the ability then to create a structure out of compacted dirt, but to embed the actual structures with IoT devices enables me to trade my surplus water and energy with the grids for financial benefits, but then also to trade, within communities. So I think two things: the fact that this starts at the most elementary level, which is a person and their dwelling and the way they participate in the community, and their choice from a privacy perspective or in terms of sharing perspective to make their own choices about whether not to or to actually participate. That's the power of this, because the ability to take these conversations and to make them visible and to get people to participate with them, and not once again to make anecdotal decisions, but make data-driven decisions. I think those are some of the things that we're excited about, specifically about the Mahon Science Park project in Botswana.
Thanks, Warren. Corinne, did I see you raising your hand there for a second?
No. I'm listening with great interest. Fascinating project, Sir Warren.
So, and it is, and I've had the pleasure of being involved in this for a period of time, but we hope it's as importantly, this is going to be replicable, and taking it from an analog perspective to a digital perspective and broadening that context throughout Africa. I mean, that is the target to do this, and bringing together some of the thought leaders, and not necessarily the big corporations from external. In fact, if anything, we are trying to go back, lean so far the other way to make sure that it's balanced amongst all of this. I will remind everyone that please, if you got questions, put them in the chat. Alex is going to help us through this in a few minutes, and after this next round of conversations, we'll move to 10 to 15 minutes worth of Q&A here for the panelists. Excuse me. As we look at, it's one of the titles of our session today was ethics and equality. What does that mean in this context? We've heard a little bit here, we talked about this. And so Corinne, I'm going to come to you first. What does this mean as from a driving two words that are front and center today in a number of different contexts, in a number of different parts of the world. But what does it mean here as it relates to this?
Well, these words are very important in this context because we don't see for now, at least in the political space, AI driving more equality. I mean, we see the creation of digital elites. I mean, as in every other continent, any other continent, by the way, but there's a growing divide between those who can use AI in particular for their political purposes and those who can't, and civil society being quite not having the same kind of skills and resources as governments have in the use of AI. And for instance, we've seen use of very sophisticated disinformation campaigns during elections. The use, Oxford University has a project on the technology and democracy that has really described extensively the use of trolls and social media bots and so on by some governing parties in context. And that's not something that a lot of actors can master at the moment. So there is really this imbalance and this asymmetry that we've discussed already between those who can and who have really very quickly not either developed their own skills for political purposes or are resorting to what we call digital mercenaries to do their work. And we know that, for instance, a lot of governments in many countries, not only in Africa, are resorting to AI-powered surveillance tools, such as facial recognition and so on. And sometimes they just pay for the services of companies that are based elsewhere, So this is what we're seeing in terms of equity, equality, and ethics is actually for now a worrying trend in this growing divide by those who can use AI for sometimes nefarious purposes and those who can't.
Nanjira, do you agree with Corinne's assessment?
Well, yeah, I mean, and, it's always when the rubber meets the road in practice that the real theater of what we put together as recommendations come up. But I like to say, let's complicate the equation and sit with our trouble, because that's the real meat of what actually happens after we recommend stuff. Now, I think a lot of our conversations about what to do just do not and especially where technology is involved, just do not accommodate this real messy theater that is our coexistence, right? And terminology has been really interesting. How terminology is used in one region may not necessarily apply. Digital mercenaries might be somebody else's digital dissident. Just, as one random example there. I just say with everything that we come to, just before we say this is the way forward, I'm always a fan of complicating it by sitting with it a bit more and saying, well, whose perspective has not been represented in how we're normalizing or popularizing a way of thinking about stuff? How can we go back to that? And how can we create more truly inclusive ways of thinking about how these different issues and technologies, as we're designing them and deploying them, could actually also mitigate the harms that we always have. We have to get to a point where we don't always have these typical tropes of, regulation slows down innovation, or we only think about ethics after the fact that a harm has been meted out on people, and especially because this pandemic has made technology so intimate in our lives.
No, for sure. All right, Warren.
Yeah, and I think for me, always, the place to start are provocative questions. I mean, when you think about, aspects, when I think about AI design, there are a couple of things that I think about. I think about validation, I think about security, I think about verification, I think about control. And under validation, this issue of, hey, did I design the right system? Is it based on the right assumptions? How does it actually improve the situation and for all stakeholders? And I think this is part of the opportunities when we take a multi-stakeholder view of both the supply side and the demand side. It gives us a better way to start thinking about balancing some of these inequalities and systems of verification. And I think the other aspect is to understand that this is only the tip of the iceberg, and it's going to get more complex. The flywheel is just going to spin faster. And I mean, right now we're talking about AI, and when we overlay it with things like quantum computing and what quantum computing will do, to an algorithmic organization, it starts creating even further imbalances. And so the thing that I think, the tools that we have to use are the tools we humans use: plan, conversations. And the issue with the planning is the ability to think in multiple time horizons, because I often find that there's an imbalance between exploration and exploitation. And when we appreciate the fact that we can think about both the explorative aspects and the exploitative aspects, that those multiple time horizons gives us a completely different view. And the thing that we know from a strategic perspective is that most organizations, because of the not having an appreciation of their life stage, always underexplore or overexploit. And all of those lead to pathologies. And that ability to appreciate your context. And once again, it's about being able to have sensing mechanisms, and that ability to have sensing mechanisms and to consistently reflect on those sensing mechanisms are the things that ground our planning in reality. And also, when we think from a planning perspective, is to move away from the single trajectory planning. The use of scenario planning, of scenario thinking, the use of things like design thinking, all forces us away from the convergent part of the thinking process and forces us to the divergent part of the thinking process. And I think where we will find a lot of value is in the diversity, in the diversity and the inclusion. A friend of mine always says, hey, diversity is being asked to the dance. Inclusion is actually dancing. So I think what we have to do is we have to create the opportunities both to be invited to the dance and then actually performing the dance.
Well, that's a good alliteration to jump into the next stage. And I've heard you mention that once before, and I have used it. You should probably copyright that conversation. So, Alex, I see that there have been some questions that have popped up here in the last 10 minutes or so that we have. Can you walk us through some of the questions, and we'll go around and I'm going to ask that the panelists and I will jump in as appropriate to answer.
Sure, yeah. So I'll ask two questions from Christina Kolklaw that have been coming through. She actually did an event with us in November. I'll put that in the chat after I've asked these questions, and then we can get to, I see Wendell Wallach, the head of the AI Equality Initiative at Carnegie Council. You just asked a question, so I'll ask that after Christina's questions. So the questions are, how will the e-commerce discussions happening on the fringes of the WTO affect African countries' ability to build and shape their own digital transformations? And on digital inequalities, how best could the global community support and empower African nations in their digital transformation? What should happen that isn't? What should stop that is?
Okay, who wants to jump in there first? Nanjira, I see you clearly have a reaction to this.
It goes back to the theater I mentioned, isn't it? Because again, the antecedent sort of global governance mechanisms will impact how digital transformation happens. And I think that's actually one interesting area where we might have more engagement from African policymakers, because all matters digital and trade are coming up for discussion, and they have a bit more muscle with negotiating some equity there. And so that's a very useful avenue for everybody who's trying to think about how digital economies here in Africa will shape up, should come up. And another area, in fact, is whether, with Africa trying to set up a continental free trade area, and down the line, there has been talk about a digital single market, whether it will threaten others for whom, politically speaking, a continent like this one getting its act together might not bode well for them. So these are the real theaters around which these questions come up. And actually, to Christina's question, the WTO is a very useful lens to see the continued discontinuities around getting these things as we go from recommendation to actually implementing them.
That was a good question, Christina. Corinne?
I couldn't unmute myself for some reason, but listen, I don't think anybody has lessons to give to Africans as they tackle these questions. But I do think that, for instance, the European Union has become a kind of regulatory superpower seen by many. I mean, the Americans, for instance, are very much looking at what the Europeans are doing in the field of the Digital Services Act to see whether they can get their act together themselves in tackling the difficult balance between free speech and disinformation. So in the same way, it was very interesting to me. I was listening to a European expert the other day, and she was saying that during the whole process of preparing the Digital Services Act and so on, they have taken into account the fact that other regions may want to look at it. So they call it they have looked at the Brussels lens and the fact that others may be looking at Brussels to show the way. And one thing which they were very conscious of, and that really influenced the way they drafted the act being considered now by the European Parliament, is that when they have refrained from asking for too much regulation because they thought that might give an excuse for some in other regions to stifle dissent, frankly, and to use regulation as a way to kill free speech. So I don't think others. I mean, I think the African stakeholders have all the tools they need to address the issues. But there are other examples that can be looked at usefully. The only, I think, global way. The global action that could be very useful is how we tackle the accountability of tech actors. Because when I was talking about the imbalance of powers, what is true in America, for instance, the fact that the big tech companies have such gigantic resources that some governments just can't go against them financially, is even truer when the resources of the governments are much smaller. So I think that's an issue that should be addressed globally, because each government is not going to be able to address it. And the fact that as we know, the assets of many of these tech companies are larger than the GDPs of many countries. That creates an imbalance that is really something that has to be addressed globally, I think, frankly. And even if there is a regulatory framework, solid one that is put in place, for instance, at the level of the African continent, if governments cannot hold really companies accountable for the implementation of this framework, what purpose does it serve? So I think that's a really important issue, Chip.
Right. No, I agree with you, Warren.
Yeah, I'll go and I'll geek out, and I would say to you, cybersecurity, right? Because the issue is that all of this stuff is built on security. And so the ability to be able to gather data and telemetry and stand up, in African countries, sensing centers so that we can prevent, the threats, essentially from propagating, I think is one of the definite things. And I think also, we're talking, I think between Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, they were talking about this concept of a digital Geneva Convention, specifically around cybersecurity, to prevent citizens being targeted by nation state actors. And I think, those things would be practical, right? Because from a security point of view, if you don't have the requisite security in place, you can't ensure people's privacy, and therefore trust is unlikely to develop, for these methods of transacting. And then, of course, the ability then to ensure a vibrant market, as Nanjira talked about, the common, what's happening in Africa. If we can't protect the intellectual property, then on what basis do we create markets?
Right. No, really valid. And I think that was a great question, Catherine. Thank you very much. Alex.
Yes. So 2 questions from Wendell Wallach. Warren, can you give us an example where the potential exploitative dimension of an implementation was recognized early on during the explorative stage? What happened? And much of the discussion has been focused upon functioning governments. How do you perceive the impact of the tech revolution in Africa on failed states?
Yeah, and I'll use an example of CRISPR, right? From a gene therapy perspective, where you have so many entities exploring, the benefits of specifically the editing, but some things are really going wrong, with gene therapy in certain cases, where, for instance, from an accessibility point of view, we almost went straight from exploration to monetization. And the price point for the access to these gene therapies that can save lives, especially in the, for some really difficult to treat cancers, becomes a really big issue. I think the other aspect is around health and health IoT and the way that is being used, because, in a South African sense, we've deployed and we've used artificial intelligence with IoT to be able to, for instance, talk about the preventable causes of death, and to make sure that we can keep individuals triaged to the primary healthcare sector. And that's showing some definitive benefits. So this issue specifically around technology and the way it is used and the way we then monetize it and the way we then think about the intellectual property protection, specifically around CRISPR, is an example that I can use, from the health sector. And of course, from a, one of the fundamental things in the digital context is, where the digital economies work is when you can blur the line between the digital and the physical. And especially as we think about, the use of data to understand when cows are able to create calves, has an impact on herd yield. And so therefore, potentially, we then, of course, can increase herd yield without a concomitant increase in input costs. But then, of course, we have to think about the greenhouse gases and what goes on in that regard. So the thing that I would say to you is one of the biggest things possibly in this regard is to think about synthesis, because a digital context is only valuable when we can synthesize all of these aspects and bring them together so that it can illuminate relationships in the ecosystem that previously we didn't see.
Thanks, Warren. I'm going to turn to the second question, the second part of this question, which is how do you perceive the impact of the tech revolution in Africa on failed states? So, Corinne, I'll run to you first, and then Nanjira.
I don't really like the term failed state because I don't know how people define it. But we've talked earlier about the fact that the speed of change was happening the fastest in very, very fragile contexts, right? Some countries which have just emerged from long and deadly conflicts like South Sudan and Somalia, and where internet penetration is happening in different ways at the moment. But let me take, in fact, an example outside of the African continent, in Lebanon, where a lot of people are saying now that Lebanon is actually a failed state nowadays. After, it was a middle-income country doing relatively well on many measures, but it has, in the last 5 years, really fallen on all measures of wealth development and so on. And when the explosion in the port of Beirut happened 2 years ago, the government didn't do anything to provide rescue to the hundreds of people who were homeless, to provide shelter, to provide assistance to all the hundreds of people who were homeless and affected by this dreadful thing. And it was young people, digitally savvy young people, who managed to provide services because they had access. And this is a population that was actually very connected and where they have a high level of digital literacy. And they were able to provide services that the government wasn't able. For instance, there are two kids, teenagers that put together a website for and an app to enable people to find each other, because lots of people were lost, family members and so on. So they did what the government should have done. So that was an example for me. So you can see it both ways. In some ways, yes, AI and digital technologies are sometimes arriving in very fragile contexts where the strong institutions needed to make sure that the benefits are drawn but the threats are minimized don't exist. But in other contexts, the digitalization and the AI technology and other related technologies can help citizens access services that they can't because the government cannot deliver them.
I really like that analogy, Corinne. Thank you. And having been engaged in that to not an extensive extent, but enough to understand and the value that was literally attributed to help save lives. And that's the difference. Nanjira, you get the last word.
Well, just to sum it up by saying, good technology in the hands of bad actors equals bad outcomes. And so whether failed, authoritarian, democratic, the intention, the intrinsic motivation of why technologies are being applied is very important. And here we've seen, for example, with facial recognition, even in so-called functioning governments, how adverse that outcome has gone. Information controls of right now, the biggest question are for maybe governments that want to retain power, and especially governments that are sensing an illegitimacy from their citizens. And so these tools can help them oppress their people, regardless of what country in the world you're in today. But at the same time, these are the tools in the hands of people who are just trying to get the services that are due to them, could also be very encouraging tools. So it does take us back to the question of, could we go back to decentralized bottom-up governance? Too bad that the world so far, the liberal world order has really been around this idea of the individual, rational actors, when we're not always rational as human beings, and we need to acknowledge that. So even as we're designing good technologies, the conversation we need to have about artificial intelligence specifically is both about the harms and risks, as not just as they might happen down the line, but as they're happening today across the board, without trying to just slap, this just is an anomaly or an aberration in a more democratically inclined government versus it's effective in I don't know what other terminology we want to use. We really need to start having less tech deterministic and solutionistic conversations and really bake these realities. Else we're going to turbocharge harms inadvertently because we do not have intellectual and morally honest conversations.
Great way to end the conversation today. I know that there were other questions that popped up, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to them today. I hope this will mean that there's enough interest that you will come to our next discussion around equitable deployment of AI in Africa. And if you have ideas or thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Carnegie Council. And on behalf of the AI Equitable Initiative and also the Carnegie Council, thank you for joining us today.